Hello, everyone. It's great to have you all here. I noticed we have people coming from all over the world, Czech Republic, Barcelona, Spain. I'm myself in France, and Andrew, you are in Malibu, California. It's great to have you, Andrew. I'll just start by introducing myself before you do. So I'm Cappy. I manage our community of mentors at Plato. We have more than 900 of them as of today on our platform, and I'll be moderating this talk. If you have any question, feel free to use the Q&A tab in the upper right corner to ask your questions. We'll be answering them in about 15 to 20 minutes. Now, thank you, Andrew, for being here today. I'll let you quickly introduce yourself.
Thanks, Kathy. Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew McVeigh. I'm currently a senior principal engineer at Amazon. I've typically always followed the individual contributor track, despite being a manager for a couple of years early on in my career. And one of the things I'll be talking to today about is how you add value as an individual contributor. So a little bit about me. I did my first degree in electronics engineering way back, probably 30 years ago now. And I was a very bad hardware engineer. I blew up a lot of stuff. And so I had a great interest in software. I was writing video games at the time for a computer called the Amiga. And I learned C programming. And so I naturally fell into software. I straight out of college, I started working in a computational linguistics department as a programmer, working on text-to-speech and doing neural networks back in the early 90s. Got a number of publications on speech research out of that. Moved into telecoms shortly after that. So started really developing quite a lot. And I was doing a lot of development at home, building games, building graphical tools and stuff like that. And then worked on sort of a small talk system for a while, then moved to the UK and started working in financial services. So I spent about 15 years bouncing around large banks, investment banks, typically working on large trading systems. Halfway through, I fell into a PhD almost by accident. So I ended up thinking about some software system I wanted to create. I contacted a couple of authors of a paper that seemed relevant, and they turned out to be the head of engineering, the dean of engineering, and the head of computer science at Imperial College, a very well-respected college in the UK. And I did my PhD there. I did it full-time while I was also working full-time, so I didn't have a lot of spare time for the family, which was one of my regrets. While I was in the UK, I got to work on some pretty prominent things. I was the first architect for the back end of the very early card from American Express called the American Express Blue Card. Ideas from that system led to my PhD, some of the thinking in it. I worked at some really large banks. 2008 was very interesting as the financial system collapsed, and just ended up doing a lot of risk analysis work around that. Got approached in about 2011 by a large gaming company in the US called Riot Games, and they make the game League of Legends. And they contacted me and said, look, we've heard of your reputation in London as an architect, etc. Do you want to come over and interview at Riot Games in the US? And at the time I thought, no, I'm not really interested. But they said, look, we'll send you and your wife over for a weekend, have a weekend holiday, and then interview on Monday, and then you've got options. And so that's how I came to join Riot Games. And I just started as a programmer there. By the time I'd finished, I'd done a lot of things. I spent 4.5 years there. I created a lot of the server-side infrastructure that was behind like 200 or so services. I worked a lot on the evolution of the back end of League of Legends, and League of Legends is by many metrics the most played game in the world, like something like 2.5 billion hours a month collectively played across the globe. It's very large in China specifically. I got a chance to architect the League of Legends game client. That's my architecture in place, which is now on 180 million desktops or so around the world. Left Riot and became the chief architect at Hulu, which is a large streaming company owned by, well, it's now owned by Disney, but it was owned by a lot of large cable TV partners at the time, and we added live TV to it, and that was a very exciting sort of 2-year push. Got a lot of good memories from that. Left there, went to work as a chief architect at a Bay Area company, a sort of advertising marketing tech company called Live Ramp up in the Bay for a couple of years. That was great. And then recently, the old CEO of Hulu, Mike Hopkins, moved to Amazon, so I contacted him and said, "You got any jobs at Amazon?" And he put me into the senior sort of principal interviewing process, which was massively rigorous. And so I'm at Amazon now and have been there for about 7 months as a senior principal, which is the individual contributor track.
Great. Thank you for that introduction. It's interesting you mentioned regrets in your career. Do you have any regrets in the choices you made in terms of your career and the different companies you worked at, the location, the job itself?
Not really. I mean, I think one of my biggest regrets, to be completely honest, is staying too long in financial services in London. I mean, it's just a very easy thing to fall into. It's well paid, but over time, I don't really think I got as much out of it as I did moving to the States and just pursuing my technical interests. I think I just got stuck too long in that domain and I wasn't really that interested in it. So one of the things I regret is not following my interests more.
Okay, yeah. So you worked in banking and video games and now at Amazon. How does the job change based on the industry you're in?
That's an interesting question. I find that there's a core set of skills which are just completely portable. So when I was in banking and I moved to write games, they put me immediately on the store system, so the in-game store. And many of the techniques I learned in banking were just applicable, but they were more serious. I was in banking because you can't lose any money. And so it was a very easy transition because the back end of League of Legends was actually made by sort of enterprise programmers initially. They come from healthcare. And so it was literally just one day I just started working gaming, and it felt like a very natural transition, I guess partially because of the factors I mentioned. But I find that, like when I went to Hulu, I'd never done online video before, but the core skills you develop in each of these different industries just leads you to a very easy transition in my experience, that there's a lot of stuff that's portable. So good skills, server-side stuff is pretty much done the same way everywhere, same set of languages and stuff like that. So yeah, I didn't really find it that difficult. And Amazon's similar, but obviously much, much larger and much more. They have a lot of their own stuff internally, obviously with AWS and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. So you've worked at companies with a few hundred employees and now Amazon with a few, like even hundreds of thousands of employees. And how does that job change based on the size of the company?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think before Amazon, the largest I'd worked at was like investment banks with 20,000 people. They're all organized in a certain way where they each have departments, et cetera, et cetera. Amazon is, in my experience, is very mindful of the ability, of the need to sort of divide and conquer. So it simultaneously feels large and very small. So, you know, you have the idea of 2 pizza teams and the teams get stuff done and they ship stuff. So it doesn't feel as intimidating as I thought it would. I mean, it's obviously massively large, but there's so many tools as well at Amazon to sort of keep in touch with people and to sort of connect with them.
Mm-hmm. And now that you've been doing this job for a few years, how do you stay sharp in your job and keep improving?
Do you mean I've been sort of in the individual contributor track for a few years?
Exactly.
I've only been at Amazon for 7 months. It's interesting. I think one of the biggest challenges as you get more senior in the individual contributor role is to stay sharpen the saw, so to speak. And I struggle with it to some extent. Like in the last couple of years, like I've found myself less interested in doing stuff on the side. But what I find it very important to have my own projects, which I do on the side to basically keep my interest level up high. Like, you can't always guarantee that you're going to work on interesting stuff at work, right? It's necessary stuff, but it may be relatively humdrum, like fix up this CI/CD pipeline or please improve the testing of this area. I find that I need to keep learning, and just those side projects I've got 2 on at the moment. Those side projects are so important to just keeping learning stuff and also having something to show people.
And do you have more senior people at Amazon who can also help you stay sharp, or are you one of the most senior people there is?
Well, in the individual contributor track, there's only 1 level above me, and it's very small. There's a very well-defined principal engineering community at Amazon, and there's a few thousand of them, and it's seen as a very important part of the way that they manage their architecture and the complexity of their systems. And so they invest a lot of time in sort of principal engineering meetups, like principal engineering lunch. They bunch us into groups and encourage us to socialize and form our own little communities. There's some actually really prominent people, very well-known worldwide engineers at Amazon, and you're encouraged to reach out to them and talk to them. So it's very much a sort of community focus. And the principal engineering community, like all the engineers there's a concept in Amazon of career roles, like say an SDE3 role would be a career role. If you want to, you can just stay at SDE3 and not be promoted. And I think then there's also the promotion path where you say, well, no, I really want to go up as high as I can. And I think both are valid approaches, but I really like the fact that Amazon also focuses on career roles. Like if you want to stay hands-on and spend most of your time programming, it's perfectly reasonable to stay in an SDE3 role for your entire career.
And for your level, what would you need to move to the most senior level there is?
Oh, well, that's a tough one. That's really tough. I mean, one of the engineers, there's only a few of them. There's one of them's James Gosling, right? The creator of Java. Like, it's a big jump. Like, you've got to do something pretty significant and have a massive impact to actually make that jump. And so it's another thing where at my level, I'm continually thinking about how to have a bigger impact. Because in some ways, you've got to build up your own engineering brand. And so I'm working on a number of things at the moment just to try and, outside of my day job, just to try and make a change and to make things better at an engineering level at Amazon.
Mm-hmm. And do you have examples of what it would take or what you're currently working on to develop that brand within the company?
Yeah, I mean, Amazon has many, many thousands of internal services running their vast number of systems. I mean, it's large. If I told you the actual number, I'd shock you. It's a very large place, and one of the challenges then with any large place with such a large set of systems is how you represent the evolution of architectures over time. There's so much going on at any one time. It's very, very difficult for me to actually know the current state of things or where they're headed at all times. There's a lot of very smart people who are fully immersed in each of these systems who do know. For my part, though, I want to make it easier for people to see and understand the evolution of the systems, and it ties into the work I did on my PhD on software extensibility and evolution of systems. I think if I can address that to some extent, in addition to doing my day job, I think it will make a big difference to how we view architecture at Amazon.
All right. And how would you describe your daily routine or daily tasks in your current role? And how do you keep providing value without coding all day, or how do you structure your impacts?
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's a really tough one because as you get more senior in these roles, you're expected to be largely self-directed. So I think there's aspects of my job which I would regard as mentoring. So it's basically providing support to the level of engineers so that they can grow. There's all sorts of technical leads and people like that who maybe are looking for an understanding of how to grow to the next level or looking for a level of support and connection through the organization. Then I tend to classify my role into broad versus deep. So broad is understanding across multiple areas, connecting the dots, synthesizing and seeing the sort of forest from the trees, so to speak. Like, oh, I see this theme over here. We need to spend more time so that we can simplify that architecture so that we can continue to build. And then there's deep work where And this is not happening as much as I'd like at the moment, partially just through my own choices of time allocation. Is the need to dive deep into some areas so to effectively keep your skill set sharp and also build up credibility.
Mm-hmm.
So
It's interesting. Yeah.
Sorry to cut you off. I tend to balance between those three aspects of the job, and not always successfully. So with the mentoring, you typically would allocate time to meet with people, and you're trying to meet with them situationally to help them on their growth path forward, and reflect back to them what you see in a sort of honest and often fairly candid way. The broad stuff is just managing themes and trying to understand and categorize stuff, and the deep stuff, well, that's a tough one. It tends to be more situational and more sporadic at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting what you mentioned about helping people grow. It's usually something we associate with managers and their core responsibility being that. Would you say that in your role, even though it's an IC role, you still have similarities with management roles, or are there things you can learn from management in your own role?
Yeah, as we were talking earlier, Cappy, one of the limitations of my earlier sort of career was I tended to write off management. I'm not a natural manager. So I tended to just regard it as not a useful thing. And as I've grown into the job over many years, I realized that that's a very naive view, that management is a really important function. The ability to organize and create a framework for people to do their work is as important as the technical work. And so I would encourage people, even if they stay on the individual contributor track, to learn from management and learn to understand how to bring the best out of people, how to manage them, how to understand how to help them partition their time. In many ways, management is a much more direct role than mine, in the sense that the managers have a particular task, they lead a particular area, and their job is to instruct and guide the engineers to fulfill a particular task. My role tends to be a bit more indirect, in that I'm influencing. I might be asking them to change their architecture. I might be involved in discussing with them to create a particular architecture or to simplify their architectures. And a lot of my role tends to come down to influence as well. Like, I want to persuade someone to do things in a particular way or simplify something. And along that lines involves growth by that individual or that team, because I will be saying, like, one of the big challenges with these large architectures is just relentless simplification. Please make sure you go back and simplify. And one of the hallmarks I've found of sort of people who haven't been engineers for a massive amount of time is that engineering attracts very smart people who can hold a lot of complexity in their head. And I feel it's a tiny little bit like the journey I've gone is a tiny little bit like the journey that I saw Pablo Picasso went on. I read a story about him once where he started off as a very, very good portrait painter. He could paint fine art and create these almost portrait-like paintings. And then once he had mastered that, he decided to move to sort of naive art style. So he went sort of, from naive as a sort of a child or a young person who constructed naive pictures to constructing very sophisticated pictures through to purposely creating the sort of naive style of artwork we know him for today. And I think in many ways, when I was younger, or when I was an earlier engineer, I focused on complexity and was very proud of the ability my ability to hold that complexity in my head. As I've got more mature in my role, I realized that simplicity is really the ultimate sophistication, like finding the elegance at the heart of systems and exposing it and making it much simpler for people to understand the system. Because let's face it, our job's hard enough as it is. The simpler you can make a system, the more room you create for making additional features on top of that and for dealing with the natural complexity of the domain.
Thank you, Andrew. We'll remember the Picasso metaphor. Let's now move on to the audience questions. So if you're in the audience, you can ask questions and upvote the ones you want to see answered. So we'll start with the first one. It shows up at the bottom of the screen. So what traits should new developers develop who aspire to become principal engineers?
Yeah, it's a good question. So firstly, make sure that you go deep. So principal engineering is built on a foundation, I think, of deep technical. So you've got to have an area that I like to sort of describe it as sort of the core competency or something like that. And for me, it's programming in a certain way. I like to create sort of server-side systems that usually have some sort of graphical presentational component, and I work on stuff like that. So certainly in your career, don't be afraid to go very, very deep technically. Then what happens is once you've got that base of deep technical skill, you can then build on it by building context and starting to look out and seeing the architecture in effect, the increased context. So you might start deep in sort of algorithmic land. Someone's asking you to optimize some rendering path software or something like that. Then you move out and you say, well, actually, I'm working as part of a game engine. What's the architecture of that game engine? Then you move out further and say, how does the game build on the game engine? What's the individual parts of the game? Then you move out further than that and say, okay, we've got a game, we've also got server side. How does that connect? And so I tend to classify that as deep work and broad work. And I find that what happens early on in your career, you can focus very much on the deep work, and the broad work comes over time. And as you get more senior, the two work hand in hand in a very powerful way to actually allow you to bring deep technical context to broad situations.
All right. Next question. How do you balance work, learning, and side projects with family time?
Yeah, very badly. I manage it very badly. With my PhD, I was doing my PhD for 5 years full-time and working for 5 years full-time during that period because, you've got kids in school, you've got a mortgage and stuff like that. And I probably ended up, it's one of my regrets, I ended up spending not very much time with my family. So I did that badly. I find at the moment that what I can do is I'll sit down with my wife, we'll have dinner and we'll play with the kids, and then at 8 o'clock we send them up to bed, and then she might do some work. She's got some sort of business interests and stuff, and she might be doing that at the kitchen table, and then I'll bring a laptop to the kitchen table and do some work. And one of the challenges is to make sure that my side work can be segmented into small units of time. One of the things I worked with a guy called Rod Johnson back in London, who created the Spring framework. If you do Java server-side stuff, you almost certainly know about it. And one of the things he did is he was creating, he over-indexed on unit testing, which meant that he could shift his context very quickly. So he'd have half an hour here, he'd write another unit test and add a little bit of functionality. And so there's engineering techniques that allow you to use those smaller snippets of time. And one of the things I do as well is I try and align stuff. So, for instance, I'm working on a side project at the moment to do architectural evolution. I believe it will help me in my Amazon job as well. And so it's very much aligned with the forces that are present in my current work as well. And I've done that before. Like at Hulu, I worked on stuff as a side project, which was very much aligned with what I was looking for at work as well. I created a set of architectural and engineering dashboards for the live service.
And would you say you found your balance now?
No, I'm a terrible, terrible time manager. If you ask my wife, she'd wholeheartedly agree with that. But I take what I can get, and so if I get time, sorry, I just got to decline a meeting. If I take time, if I find time, I've got to make sure that the projects I've got can align with the use of that time. And it's a challenge, it's a continual challenge for me.
All right, next question. How does Amazon go about mentoring senior engineers to grow them into principal engineers? Well,
Amazon, like every other place I've ever been to, will have a matrix which describes the set of levels and the expectation at each of those levels. I've never seen it done as rigorously as at Amazon. So firstly, they set that bar and you have to go through a peer review and you have to be reviewed by an outside tech firm. You have to be reviewed by a set of people in higher levels and stuff like that to actually get these promotions. So there's an understanding of a bar. And Amazon also has this concept of that they'll only hire into a role if they believe that the person they're hiring is going to be above average for their current bar internally. So there's more than any other place I've been at, Amazon is very mindful of what it takes to be promoted. So within that context, you've got where you need to be headed. And then it's a matter of, I guess, working with each of the different components. Like if you're going to be assessed by your peers, then understand how to work with your peers. Like to a large extent, it's on you to grow into that space that you want to grow into. So if, for instance, you need to understand that the work is typically focused on, at a particular level, say principal engineering is focused on organizational architecture and product solutions, then work to grow that and seek out the people who can help you with that. Simultaneously, so that's your own sort of agency as an engineer to sort of be working up to that next level of promotion. My role is to work with the engineers who are looking for that level of promotion or looking for that level of mentoring, to work with them to identify their gaps and to actually sit down and be honest with them about some of the gaps I see and some of their areas of strength. Like I'll sit down with one engineer, for instance, and I'll say, look, so Amazon also has these 14 leadership principles, which are very mindful. Like one of the principles is invent and simplify things. Like I've got it here somewhere. I keep them to hand because I find them so useful. But let me bring one up here. Here we are. Invent and simplify. Leaders expect and require innovation and invention from their teams and always find ways to simplify. They're externally aware, look for new ideas from everywhere and not limited by, not invented here. As we do new things, we accept we may be misunderstood for long periods of time. So these are publicly available leadership principles of Amazon. And so one of the things we do is we tend to see through the prism of those leadership principles. So I'll be working with an engineer and say, look, you're under indexing on the simplification tenet. You really need to work on that. So it's very mindful here, and the expectation is that I'm growing the next leadership layer.
Right, and so you mentioned you usually identify gaps and mentor people on these gaps. And so what are the most common gaps you've seen in the people you're helping grow to the next level?
Yeah, so a common gap is people just to continue to focus on deep work rather than moving out and understanding the wider context. Another gap is not reaching out enough, similarly to the broad sort of work, not reaching out enough to the other teams and involving yourself in more than just your day job. There's many sort of attributes that we could sort of identify as sort of stereotypical engineering attributes. Sometimes people under-index on the EQ element. It's very important to realize that systems are created by people, not robots. And those people have, lives, they have worries, they have, situations they go through. And we need to also bear that in mind. As we get more senior, we need to be, I think, more empathic and more compassionate to the people that we work with.
Right. And do you get mentored yourself also?
Yeah, it's there. I mean, it's like the VP of the area reached out to me and said, you need to do this. And it was useful information. He said, I see a gap. And I think I know the gaps as well. It's just that I'm not maybe doing enough to address them at the moment because I've got my own views on. And plus, onboarding to such large organizations, it typically involves a learning curve. It's not uncommon. And this is one of the really interesting things when I started work at Amazon. They presented me a clarity curve and they said, over the next 6 to 9 months, your clarity level is going to dip and then go back up again to what you thought it was. And I think that's pretty accurate. It's just a massive learning curve to understand how to operate effectively within such a fast-moving and highly performing organization.
All right. Let's move to the next question. We have quite a few to go through. So, as you mentioned, at your level and scope, influencing and persuading are part of your role. Can you talk about how you influence and persuade teams? What tactics do you use?
So there's a leadership principle at Amazon. I think I'm just looking at it. It's let me just let me see if I can put in the chat. These are the leadership principles. Amazon leadership principles. I guess I'm going to refer to some of those. So what was the? So can you repeat the question again?
Sure, it's also at the bottom of your screen. So as you mentioned that your level and scope, influencing and persuading are part of your role. Can you talk about how you influence and persuade teams? What tactics do you use?
So thank you for that. One of the leadership principles is earns trust. And I'm just going to put it there in the chat window. One of the things that I find is really powerful is just being honest and candid and avoiding politics. I feel that as well, just not being too hung up on seniority and stuff. Like I would expect that I can talk to any engineer at any level and have a sensible conversation where they can push back to me and say, I don't think that's right. And that simultaneously builds up trust, gives me more information. I think as well, bringing a level of maturity and knowing what battles to fight. Also knowing how to react situationally, and also your career, you build up a lot of architectural techniques, a lot of development techniques, bringing those to the plate and saying, well, I think this needs adjustment because of this principle and things like that. So that certainly helps. And I would regard the need to persuade people as a really valuable thing to continue to sharpen my ability to persuade people. And so what I would say is there's no tricks. Authenticity and engineering principles are the things that should be persuading people. And if you can't make a persuasive argument that's honest and candid, then maybe there's no argument to be made.
All right, and does that come with time, I suppose? For example, in your role, you've only been there 7 months. Do you feel like you're already influencing and persuading the people you work with?
Not as much as I want to. No, it's an ongoing thing. I mean, at Amazon, you have people who've been there 20 years or more, and they've built up enormous networks and obviously demonstrated an enormous amount of value. It's a big ask, and so I hope to grow into it. Certainly, I think I bring a number of positive things to the role in terms of newness. You know, the idea of beginner's mind, you're seeing things afresh, which lets you sort of understand that it's not really the way it's meant to be. For instance, if you're looking at a complex system, you can sort of suggest simplifications and stuff. And that does get back to a very interesting point as well about the sort of the notion of imposter syndrome when you're sort of faced with new situations versus the notion of beginner's mind, which is approaching things from a new perspective and not being embarrassed about it.
Yeah. Okay. We have a question about early on in your career. So how do you think being a manager, lost the question. So how do you think being a manager early on helped or hurt your career?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think so. When I was at Barclays Capital back in early 2000s, I managed a group of maybe 10 people. I realized that the overhead of that, there's a lot of administration and looking after people and stuff that takes you away from a lot of technical work. And I think you can combine the two, but as it goes to scale, like management does involve a lot of overhead. I felt that I wasn't good at it. I did see though, I got a lot more empathy by doing that management role for the stuff that managers were doing and some of the challenges they face. And so that led to me working better with managers and being less disrespectful of the profession. I do still very much expect that managers are technical. And they don't have to be technical in the sense of being hands-on developers, but I do very much come from the school of thought that expects that the manager should, in theory, be the technical lead of the area. It's not always the way. They often supplement it with a right-hand architect or et cetera, but I regard it as an anti-pattern if a manager is just doing people stuff and doesn't know anything about the domain or the product they're working on. And unfortunately, in some firms, it is quite common to have that dual track where the IC stuff is you do the technical stuff and the manager path is, I just look after career growth and the happiness of the team. I regard the latter as a massive anti-pattern.
And so through your management experience, you said you learned empathy, and how do you teach that to people who don't have the chance to manage at some point in their career?
I think my early career was marked by a level of, I'll just be outright and say it, maybe a level of arrogance and disdain for stuff that wasn't like me. As I've gone through life and experienced things, and also had some really forceful lessons where people have said some really candid things to me that have really hurt and corrected me over time, I realized that just being empathic and understanding the other person's situation can just bring so much to working as a group to accomplish a technical task. People don't work well when they're under pressure or they have a lot of things on their mind that are not related to getting stuff done at work. And I think we can be kind to each other. You know, there's absolutely no reason for us not to be kind, even as much as one of the things I did early on in my career, I think, is I tended to be unkind because I might have viewed other people as maybe less technical or less capable. And I think that's not the right way to view it. It's the right way to view it is to view us as humans first and foremost, who are bringing different things to the table that accomplish the creation of these amazing engineering systems. And I would like it if people regarded me as kind, if that's the impression I gave out in the end.
Great. We now have a question about your technical vision. So do you feel like in your role you're contributing to the technical vision? Any advice on how to create a vision strategy?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because this is largely a synthesis job, I think, that there's many different parts, and vision and strategy sort of at the technical level can come down to, I think this architectural style is better in this situation. There's a lot of power in creating an architecture which is in line with the vision. So I've also worked on that side, which is, I regard that as, in a way, as a technical vision, where I've been given the product direction from people. Like when I was at Riot Games, I was given the product direction fully from others. Like I worked very closely with the product owner, and his name was Luke, and Luke said, this is what I want the product to do. These are the tenets I want you to respect. Can you create an architecture for that? And so I could create the architectural vision for that, which involved an extensible system. This was the League of Legends game client, as I said, on over 180 million desktops worldwide. Understanding that vision was important, but it's also, sometimes you cross over the road and you sort of work on the product vision as well. So I sort of move between those areas because I'm expected to. And in part, that's because a lot of the systems we create have a technical component. Like, for instance, at Amazon, there's a component which involves operators reviewing contracts and approving them. That is a level of product design that I can get involved in. There's other people whose job will be to, we want to redesign this part of Amazon so it looks this particular way, that I don't get involved in. But yeah, so one of the things I would say as well is that in line with creating a product vision is pairing is very important. There's people whose roles are to be product owners, and pairing with them, because you're bringing different sides to the table. Like they may be saying, well, I want it to do this. You say, why do you want it to do that? It'd be much easier if we did this. And they go, okay, that's interesting, because that opens up a whole new world of possibility as well.
You mentioned earlier the importance of having impact in order to move to the most senior level. Do you think contributing to the technical vision is an example of how you could be having more impact?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you the higher up you go, the more you're expected to contribute to the higher level stuff. What I'd say though is, and this is can be a bit of an anti-pattern, is impact has many forms. Like fixing up a test pipeline has an impact. It may not be as visible. And so one of the things we want to avoid is the bias visible, the bias towards visibility rather than making that impact. So as engineers, we want to fix things, we want to create things, regardless as to whether or not it's necessarily going to result in a great PR byline. So yeah, it's a challenge, because one of the challenges with any system of of leadership principles, any system of culture it's going to get weaponized in a certain way. And one of the things I'm on the lookout for is just in every job I've been in is making sure that it's not just the most visible things that are valued. Because that visibility bias is actually a bit of a trap.
Right, that makes sense. And at your level, do you still feel like you can do invisible things that have impact? Or the higher you go, the more visibility you're going to have?
So that's raises a really interesting question about how you brand yourself and how you actually communicate upwards and sideways and downwards what you're doing. And I think the onus to a large extent is on engineers to communicate their own value. So for instance, it's completely reasonable, I think, if you go in and you decide to fix a testing pipeline that was broken, to try and create some buzz around the fact that you've done that. So in some ways, you have to be a bit of a self-promoter. And so your job is to raise the visibility as well. And so in conjunction with people like myself, whose job is to surface the more mundane things sometimes. It's not just the big flashy things that we should celebrate, because the danger with big flashy things is there's always a new big flashy thing coming up. And there's a lot of boring stuff in the background, like for instance, fixing up tech debt, improving testing stats, improving the resilience of the systems and the reliability. A lot of those things are actually, if you look at it, a lot more important in sort of isolation than, I'm adding this new big feature. I'm not sure if anyone wants it, but I'm going to add it anyway because it's got great visibility.
We now have a question about interviews. How are job interviews for principal engineers different from, say, staff engineers?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the principal engineers are easier. The interviews are easier. In some ways, they're harder. So they're easier in the sense that they may give you a bit of leeway on the technical side. They may say, write me an algorithm to do this. And you're writing it and you go, oh, wait a sec, I've forgotten how I sort a list in Java, right? And they go, oh, no, it's okay. It's done like this as long as you've got the idea. Whereas you wouldn't get away with that at a SDE3 level. They'd be like, well, you're supposed to be working this all day, every day. Well, that's an example that I'd use at a previous place. I'm not sure what it works like at Amazon. I don't have enough experience with the interview process. But at the principal level, you're doing bigger things like, tell me how you impacted an entire department. Tell me, give me an example of a project you worked on where you had a fundamental voice in the architecture and why you did it that particular way. So it's looking not only at the deep things, which, to be honest, you get a bit less sharp over time if you're not careful. And so for the principal engineering interview for Amazon, I did spend about a month just sharpening up with coding exercises because I knew I'd be tested on those. And I find these stressful, by the way. I guess everyone does to some extent. In the first interview I did with Amazon, the first hour, I was interviewed by a senior principal engineer. It's a big thing at Amazon. The guy, I think he had 32 patents to his name, and he asked me to write an algorithm. And I got so nervous in that first 10 minutes. I said, look, I'm going to have to stop the interview just temporarily, go and get a drink and come back. And I did that and came back, and he was very compassionate and said, look, I understand it's your first interview for a while, and it's early in the morning. So it was quite a compassionate situation. I thought quite kind and very, very mindful. But yeah, you will get interviewed on the things that determine whether or not you can make an impact at that level. So some of the questions you get asked are along the lines of, tell me when you improved engineering across a company. And it's things like that, when you get into the details, they're very hard to fake. Because if you say, oh, I made a system and everyone loved it, it's like, well, how are you going to provide me evidence for that?
All right, the next question is asking for advice. So our product is 10 years old and has scaling issues, many of which have roots legacy decisions. What advice would you give to engineers who grapple with entrenched legacy decisions that undermine present-day application?
Yeah, that's a really deep question. I think one of the challenges with any architecture is to partition it. And what I mean by that is to come up with a vision where you can partition out the different parts and park some of the legacy stuff behind components that could potentially over time be replaced. Because say with some of the legacy stuff, and I can't speak to your particular situation directly, Alan, but like say in a robotics system, right, where and some of these things get quite complex because like some of the planning systems for robots might span multiple domains, but you try and isolate out the separation and separate out the concerns into isolated parts so that the problem is not how do we replace the entire system, it's how do we replace this isolated part that's now no longer fit for purpose. And if you can get to that partitioning, and an architectural North Star is really important to sort of say, well, this is how we want the system to look. Let's now do work to repartition this legacy stuff without necessarily changing it so that we can replace it later on. You can get to a very powerful situation where you don't have to junk your entire architecture or your entire system, but you can start looking at it as sort of, well, now I've got the house, the house is largely renovated. I now need to do the bathroom over here and this other bedroom, and then we'll be done with the house. To quote a very painful building metaphor, I've been having upgrades on my house for the last year. I feel like the builder is like part of the family at this point.
It changes from the Picasso metaphor.
Yeah.
Next question. Can you talk about any example of technical mistakes you did in your career while setting a vision or strategy for your group? And how did you recover from it? Anything we can learn from those incidents?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the largest mistake I worked on was a large financial system. I don't claim to be fully responsible for the demise of this, but it's a very large financial system. It's probably worth $100 million in development, maybe even a bit more at the time, back in sort of very early 2000s. And there's a lot of hubris. They wanted a very complex system, and we went into the meta far too far. It was a system for doing clearing of financial products, and we dissolved it all into cash flows, and the consultancy that sold it to the financial house was basically selling a very big vision they couldn't pull off. And so it was fairly clear to me early on that we were doing something that was more complex and more ambitious than we could cope with. In addition, there were many other dimensions, but I think I learned a lot in that job just by the fact that as you're doing stuff, these are typically 3-year projects, as you're doing stuff if it's not going to work out, and it's your job to surface it and find solutions and alternatives. And so one of the things I've learned over the past is don't worry about not being too clever when you're making stuff, and don't worry about simplifying and relentlessly trying to look for simplifiers. And I didn't do that in this particular case, and it led it off a cliff. As I said, I don't just blame myself. Certainly there were many, many other contributing factors, but I learned a lot about just being humble and being candid and also knowing when to get out. Sometimes you are in situations where you just can't fix it. The political, the management, the sort of consultancy factors are so aligned against a successful solution that sometimes the right thing to do is just to say, I'm not going to participate.
All right, next question. What was your role as a chief architect? What recommendations do you have for a new chief architect where the role is not well defined?
Yeah, so my recommendation is to define the role and to use that as a chance to get agreement and consensus across the stakeholders about what the role should be doing and what's the important thing to focus on. Otherwise, it's just very difficult to know what to focus on. And in doing that, in finding that mission, right, you're effectively organizing the role yourself, but doing it in a way where other people agree that you're adding the value, because effectively you need to add value somehow. In my role in the Bay Area company, I don't think I did that sufficiently well enough, or at least I chose not to do it well enough, because sometimes it's boring. One of the things I wish I'd done more is dive deep into the product and understand the product deeply. It was a very complex product, by the way. I wish I'd understood more about how the product worked and some of the nuances, how customers used it. I wish I'd dived more into the implementation and actually chose to dive deep in parts. But all of these things, it's important to be completely explicit and transparent about your mission statement and where you're adding value and what will actually help.
We have a question about your PhD. So can you elaborate a little bit more on your time working on a PhD while working full-time? Can you give any advice if someone was considering doing something similar?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, so for about 5 years before I did the PhD, I was having this idea of replaceable components. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if the component language for structuring components actually had the ability to do replacement, which is sort of like adding evolution to a language, rather than regarding evolution as a concern of, say, a version control system, regarding it as an intrinsic part of the language for assembling systems. And so it sort of became a bit of an obsession of mine. And one of the things I'd say is, if you're going to do a PhD, find an idea that's interesting enough to you that can last you 5 years. It's very, very common for people just to finish college and then do really well, and then a professor will say, I've got an idea for stochastic feedback loops of control systems, and you go, okay, tell me more about it. Okay, I'll work on it. You've got to find something that is truly interesting to you, such that I would have been working on this even if I hadn't been doing a PhD in some form or another. What I'd say as well is learn to partition your time. I'm not a great partitioner of time, so I would just tend to sit down, and my wife would complain all the time, and she said, I see you at the computer, you're just wasting time browsing the web. And that's true, because I didn't use my time effectively. If there's one thing I wish that was better about my fundamental sort of engineering makeup, is that I wish I was much better at using time effectively. And so really, PhDs are a function of interest, finding supervisors who know how to manage you and you can also manage, because it's very common to go into a PhD and then after 4 years or 3 years have a falling out with your supervisors, then you're suddenly left without a PhD, and that's a lot of investment. And also just managing that time effectively. But if you think about it, right, we all have enough time in the day to do a lot of stuff, right? Like, I'll give you an example, right? My wife went away to Mexico to look after her mother who just had an operation. I spent that entire week, I watched the entire Big Bang Theory, all I think there's 12 seasons of it, right? Like, I think I added it up. It was like 92 hours or something like that. I can only imagine what I could have done if I had spent that time working on an engineering system. So I don't believe anyone doesn't really have enough time. It's just where you choose to put your time. And what I would say as well, don't make the mistake I did and deprioritize family.
We have a few minutes left, so we'll do one last question. I can imagine that as your impact is much wider, the feedback loop for your work is getting longer. How do you still get the sense of accomplishment, acknowledgement from day to day, week to week?
I think you have to create the sense of accomplishment yourself. And so that's why I'm sort of working on side projects, which I hope will generate a positive impact on, say, a place like Amazon. And I've done it very successfully at previous places where it tends to bleed in with my side work. I'm never having any trouble getting feedback. If I go to someone and say, what do you think of me? They'll give me a very candid assessment. And it may literally be something very harmful, or not harmful, sorry, some theoretically hurtful, where, look, I don't think you're doing a very good job. I really wish you'd paid more attention to this over here. And I don't elicit that feedback enough. So I think there's two sides to this. One is the side which gives me enough feedback and enough encouragement to go on. And there's the other side which gives me the feedback to allow me to correct accurately so that I'm doing a better job. And the stuff that is encouraging me to go on is where, like, I sat down with my manager a few weeks ago and I said, look, I just think I'm doing very badly. I don't know what I'm doing in this particular area. And he fed back and he said, no, it's not as bad as you think. You did this well and you did that well. I can't comment on the other thing, but I just wanted to feed back to you that you're being a bit more hard on yourself than you should otherwise be. So you simultaneously got to learn to rely a bit less on the approval of others. And I think in Amazon, to some extent, they encapsulate that in a leadership principle called have backbone, disagree, and commit. I think it's called that. Have backbone, disagree, and commit. One of the challenges is doing your job well sometimes means you can become very unpopular. I was never less popular than at Riot Games when I pivoted the architecture of the League of Legends game client. There were people actively disliking me at that time. It was absolutely the right decision, and I don't regret it for a minute, but it came at a personal cost. So yeah, you're just going to have to get over that one.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us today, and for everyone in the audience for being here. If anyone's interested, Andrew shared the Amazon leadership principles in the chat. Otherwise, they can be found online, I suppose. So thank you, everyone, again for attending. And if you're wondering more about Plato, you can always check out our website, and we'll see you all at another event. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.